So, good morning, Stefanie. It's good to be here with you. We're talking about Are Doulas an Essential Service? So, if you would like to go ahead and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Stefanie Antunes. I've been a doula and a childbirth educator for 17 years. Funny enough, my first year as a doula was the year of SARS. So of course I didn't have a really busy practice at the time. It didn't impact me that much except for everything that I was hearing from other doulas at the time. So here we are 17 years later. I am the owner of a couple of doula practices and a hospital program that operates out of 4 sites. I'm also a DONA trainer and on the DONA International Board of Directors.
Great. Yeah, and I'm Allison Thompson. I'm the founder of Birthly. I provide childbirth education as well as for parents, as well as continuing education for birth professionals. And I also happen to have a degree in criminology, so I have a little bit of insight into the law and how that works. And so, yeah, we're talking today about where do doulas fit in right now during COVID-19, and the fact that businesses are limited to providing essential services when it's in person.
Yeah, and it's a stressful time. It's a stressful time for people. I want to acknowledge how much everyone's struggling with their livelihood, their own emotional, mental health, having all kinds of people maybe in the house that they're not used to having, and all of those different dynamics. And then you throw in the middle of that this really obscure, broad but narrow list that the government puts out, and then narrows it even further a couple of weeks later. And here we are thinking, do I fit in there? If I do, where do I fit in there? Is it special circumstances? Is it across the board? And so I think a lot of us have been looking into that in the last couple of weeks, but specifically the last week since that list became more narrow last Friday, April 3rd. And so that's what we want to talk about and share some information and some thoughts. And I want to acknowledge for myself that I am no expert on the law or the interpretation of the law. What I have done is collected information from direct sources, had conversations, and explored some different ideas with lots of different people to see where this all lands. So this is my opinion.
Great. Yeah, so let's start out with some of the authorities who have come out in support of doulas, that doulas should be considered a part of the healthcare team.
Mm-hmm.
So AWON early on, that's the Association of Women's Health, Obstetric and Neonatal Nurses.
Mm-hmm.
They came out with a statement early on in this pandemic that doulas should not be considered a support person. Instead, they should be considered an essential part of the healthcare team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that we've seen from, over the last few years. We've seen more and more organizations valuing the support that a doula can bring, specifically with vulnerable populations or at-risk populations and demographics. And we know from a statistical perspective, we know what the research says on doulas is pretty supportive. So that doesn't surprise me that they came out with such a firm stance really early on. That was really, really amazing and made me really happy, of course.
Yeah, and another organization that's come out in support of doulas is the BC Centre for Disease Control and the Provincial Health Services Authority in BC. And what they say is that this is for COVID-19 positive women who are giving birth or persons under investigation, that visitors should be limited to one support person, not including the doula. Mm-hmm. So even with a person who's tested positive for COVID-19, they're saying that a doula should be included as part of the care team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty big statement. Definitely I think we've seen a little bit more forward movement from doulas in BC more so than, or maybe before other provinces, what we've seen in other provinces. I think Ontario is has a really solid association of doulas, and probably the most advanced in terms of a provincial association. But in terms of sort of the movement and respect, I think when we look to BC, we see that they had doulas probably the earliest in Canada. We saw a little bit more professional traction there. So that doesn't surprise me either.
Right, so they've really advocated within the system to be included.
Yeah, and there are actually quite a few programs there where doulas are part of the system. There's even a program in BC where doulas are actually being funded for at-risk populations.
Oh, so, wow, that's amazing. I didn't know that.
Yeah, super cool.
Yeah, and then even the Society for Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada, they remain fairly neutral on this topic. What they're saying is that each individual hospital should make the decisions that are right for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just showing that section of the SOGC right here. They have, of course, some recommendations for antepartum care, so before someone's in labor. And here we see their recommendations for interpartum care, so that's when someone is specifically in labor. And, again, like you're saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't have people whose partners are asymptomatic in the room. That makes sense, right? If we have an asymptomatic, if we have a symptomatic partner or family member as the support person, that probably doesn't make the most sense. But of course, that person still deserves to have support. And really what they're saying here is sort of, like you said, more broad. Every system kind of needs to make their own decisions for what makes sense for the intrapartum time.
Yeah, and the interesting thing too about these statements is that they're not for all women giving labor during the COVID-19 pandemic. They're specifically for women who are either persons under investigation or who have actually tested positive for COVID-19. Mm-hmm. So these are the people that the most stringent conditions would need to be applied to.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so to me, that's suggesting that, for women who are healthy and who have been self-isolating, that certainly if they were to make the choice to have their doula physically present, that would be a very valid position to take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things I've realized in 17 years of doing this work is that, the experience that we might have personally of what life is, of what being married is, of what having a baby is, that our experience of that is really quite narrow. But the more that we work with families, especially if we're working with a lot of different families who come from a lot of different cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, a variety of medical and mental health situations, what we realize is that this notion of what we think is right or wrong is very different than the rest of the world, what the rest of the world might think. And one of the things that I know for sure is that the person's partner may not be the most appropriate person to accompany a laboring person when they're in labor. And I think it's important for us to get those really restrictive ideas that we have in our minds of who should or shouldn't be there, and recognize that first of all, there's no such thing as should or shouldn't, right? That comes from a really narrow viewpoint. So there's really what's going to be right for every family. And as doulas, it's one of the things we really emphasize and talk a lot about is families need to make the decisions that are right for them. And that doesn't stop right now just because we're in the middle of a pandemic. They continue to need to make the decisions that are right for them. And you think about all of the different types of relationships that exist, and maybe having a doula present is the most appropriate support person for that particular person.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. When I had my first baby back in 1990, I was in an abusive relationship, and I definitely, so doulas were pretty new back then. When I gave birth, I didn't even know about doulas. It wasn't until shortly after I had my baby that I knew about them even. Mm-hmm. But I did have a friend who accompanied me and was my support person. And, you know, it just, like, for someone in that kind of situation, it's really, yeah, kind of, I mean, the father of my child was present during the labor and birth, but as a support person, completely useless to me.
Right. So in a time when that's restricted, you know, in a time where maybe that person can't rely on their other friends, maybe their friends are in, you know, higher risk situations than the doula might be, or not able to commit to, you know, dropping everything that they're doing on a dime to come and support them in labor because their kids are home, you know, alone, or who knows what the situations are. And I think that's my point, is that it's not on us to decide, you know, what situations qualify or don't qualify. I mean, that's up to our clients to be saying, hey, I really need you right now, right?
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because, you know, not everyone who's giving birth is going to be a first-time parent during this time. So what do you do then with your other kids, right? Like, you have to be able to have either a child care person there, or, you know, your partner stays home with the children and you have someone else be your support person.
Yeah.
So in either of those cases, there's an extra person having contact with the family unit.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely think there's a lot of different stressors, you know, being put on expectant families right now and new families right now. And I can't even imagine, you know, having a baby in this time. So I really feel for them. And yeah.
Now, I think, you know, the hospital policies in this area, all the hospitals have gone to a one support person policy. So I think it's important to talk a little bit about how people can advocate for themselves if they do want that in-person doula. Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about this the last few days, and I think one of the things that's really important for people who are giving birth during this time is to really work with their care provider, right? So with their obstetrician, with their midwife, even writing a letter and having that as part of their, you know, of their file. Getting their care provider maybe even to write a letter to the head of obstetrics of the hospital, if that's where they're planning to give birth, or even the hospital that they'd be transferred to if they're planning now a home birth, and really just putting it up front, you know, that it's really important to them and why it's important to them. So I don't know, what are your ideas about advocating?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to say that I think the most appropriate thing right now, when possible, is for us to be providing virtual support. So I think most of us agree on that point. As much as possible, we want to limit contact with people. We know that that is critical in the stage of this pandemic right now, is to reduce or eliminate the amount of contact we're having with other people. I think it's also important for us to understand as doulas and for clients to weigh what is the risk benefit reward or ratio there. What's the point at which the restriction is causing more harm than the potential exposure would cause? And I think that's something that's case by case. So, you know, I think if we're talking about a client who maybe has had massive trauma in a previous birth, is absolutely petrified of going into the hospital, would rather have their birth at home without a care provider than to go into a hospital. I think when we're talking about those extreme situations where people are starting to make other decisions based out of fear, and where the risks of those decisions might be worse than, like you said, you know, advocating, going to their care provider, going to the patient care advocate in a hospital, going to, you know, whoever it is and saying, here's my unique circumstance. Here is why I feel like I desperately need this person by my side in labor. And that's not for us to decide. That's for them to decide, right? We're there as doulas is to support them through their decision-making process. And I think one of the things I always say to my clients is, if you tell me that this is where you want to head, this is your goal, but you're going in that direction, I'm going to say to you, hey, just so you know, you're kind of heading in the opposite direction of your goal here. And not to say you should turn around, but hey, did you know you're going in the opposite direction from what you told me you wanted? And then that gives us an opportunity to chat a little bit further about that and really process, why is that happening? And what are the benefits and trade-offs of staying on that path? What are the benefits and trade-offs of turning around and heading towards the other path? And I think that's what we need to be helping people do right now. So again, reiterating, for a healthy family who is really doing amazing, they're comfortable, they're confident, they wanted a doula for some extra support, does that person need to have us in person? You know what? Probably not. And those people can really benefit from all the virtual support that we're offering. Doulas are coming up with all kinds of creative ways of supporting people in hospital virtually, using Zoom, using FaceTime, using Skype, using whatever. There's all kinds of different ways, even if it's just phone, even if it's text support every half an hour. There's a lot of ways that people can do that for families that are healthy and that feel okay to handle this on their own, despite the fact that it wasn't their initial preference. What we're talking about today is we're talking about those unique situations where not having the doula, either birth or postpartum, can cause more harm than having them there.
No, I totally agree that first, the first line is to really promote that virtual support. And then if it's clear that the client feels that's not sufficient for them, then you move forward from there. Yeah, and the hospital advocate, that's a really good point to touch base with them.
Yeah, so there's more than just the OB or midwife to talk to.
That's right. Yeah. Because I think it's really important that any doulas who are possibly offering in-person support, it be really upfront, it be completely transparent and open, that, because I've heard a few things out there of, well, what if I just came as a friend, and that kind of idea. And I think, personally, that's a really bad idea, that we really should be, if we are stepping into that role, then we should be doing so completely openly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, okay, I wanted to just highlight here too that the World Health Organization, in their statement, and again, this statement is about women who have tested positive for COVID-19, that they are entitled to a safe and positive childbirth experience that includes having a companion of choice present during delivery. And so, a companion of choice might be your partner, but it could potentially be a doula.
And that could be a vital service for that particular family. Imagine someone who tests positive and then their partner is positive and now they have to have a baby. I mean, I just can't even imagine someone having to have a baby on their own with COVID-19. Oh my gosh, it just seems absolutely crazy.
Yeah, it really, it does seem, cruel even.
It really does. Yeah, and I want to highlight the fact that New York City, which we know is one of the areas experiencing the worst of this pandemic right now. There were a few hospitals in Manhattan that had started limiting to no support. So people were going in and laboring on their own with zero support. They were not allowed to have anyone. And that did not last very long before the governor issued an executive order saying that was going to stop right now, and that all pregnant people were allowed to have at least one support person. And there are reasons for that. They're in the middle of everything that's going on, and I have full appreciation, or as much appreciation as I can possibly have, not being a nurse or doctor, for that frontline staff and their protection. We also need to be considering the mental health of the other people who were being affected by this pandemic. And so forcing a laboring woman to labor alone in what should be the most happy day of their lives, and traumatizing them in a way that could last short-term and long-term, I think that has to be weighed against how we're working to provide some safety for that frontline staff as well. And there's a balance there. We cannot get hung up on prioritizing one group of people over all other groups of people in a society. That, that's very, very difficult. I'm glad I'm not one of the people making decisions in all of this. But there's a lot of factors to consider, and we have to look at all those factors because we're talking about humans here, not machines.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point that in New York, that no support person policy was very short-lived, because I know, talking to people who are potential clients or my own clients, people are afraid that that's going to happen here too. And I think we have to remember that, the United States healthcare system is a very different thing from the Canadian healthcare system.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of the pandemic too, if you look at it per capita, then Canada has roughly half the infection rate of the US.
Yeah, and we're much more spread out too, right? I mean, we're second largest country, so for sure we have a much smaller population and we're much more spread out, and so I think that bodes well for us for sure.
Yeah. So what other consequences might come out if we aren't allowing, if doulas aren't attending births in those special circumstances?
Mm-hmm. I think that's the question that needs to be asked here. And maybe that's easier asked of people who've been doulas for a really long time or who serve a really diverse population, versus people who maybe doulas who've been in practice for a short period of time and serve a very specific target market or demographic. I absolutely think that there are some clients who are totally fine not having their birth or postpartum doula that they had hired, and that could, postpartum doula could start after this is lifted in a couple of weeks. The restrictions on the essential worker list, and that changes, and we start to expand that a little bit. Maybe that's a more appropriate time for doulas to go back to working with families. But I think there are some unique situations where the risk of not having the doula is greater than the risk of having the doula. And for example, we had a client with a really complex medical situation that was sort of further aggravated by having a scheduled cesarean, which was in part because of all of the health situations happening. And that person had hired our organization to provide overnight support for the first week after birth. They had other children in the home that the other partner was taking care of. The partner was still working. I mean, can you imagine saying to that particular client, sorry, you're on your own now, providing 24/7 care after major surgery, despite all of your physical limitations and disabilities because of all of these health conditions, we can't come. I just think the harm to that family and the most likely outcome for that particular family would be a hospital readmission for that birthing person. So I would be really hard pressed to be convinced by anyone that that person is better off without us. That person is not better off by not being there for their family, by not being there for their partner, for their new baby, because they're readmitted into the hospital because they're not getting the necessary respite that they need to heal as quickly as possible so that they can care for their family and their new baby. So in a situation like that, and I think there are 1,000 different examples of that are all different because families have all different scenarios. But when I look at that, I just can't for the life of me see how that person's better off without us. I will say that we are taking really specific precautions to limit the exposure to those clients. Things like our doulas who are working with families in those unique circumstances are only working with one family at a time. We're not going from family to family to family to family, increasing all the exposure for all those people. We're talking about someone assigned to one family, a doula who is self-isolating outside of that one client contact, who's not having any contact with the outside world, who doesn't have partners in the home or children in the home who are going in and out. A doula who is changing clothes before they get to a family's home, who is wearing a mask, who is using gloves when needed and appropriate. I think all of those precautions, and there are many more that we're following right now, create the safest environment possible in an impossible solution to mitigate the risks that the client would face without us. I think that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and even, even with either labor doulas or postpartum doulas, you can also practice physical distancing in some cases, and true. So that should be also done as much as possible in those in person, as well as, of course, the mask is extremely important to protect your clients. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also, things like for the breastfeeding consultants, if there's a lot that can be done online. Definitely, all of them, I think, right now are doing their best to provide that support virtually. Mm-hmm. But in some cases, especially with latching problems, it's not always going to be able to be resolved online, and that could be definitely the end of that breastfeeding relationship if that person doesn't get that in-person support. Yeah,
I really hope families are reaching out to get the support they need in whatever format. And, and I know some families are uncomfortable with the idea of virtual support, but I really hope that we can all work as professionals and with our clients and with potential clients. And I encourage families that are listening to this to kind of move past that discomfort, because ultimately that support, it could make a really big difference in their baby's health, their long-term goals with regards to specifically, like you said, like infant feeding and breastfeeding and breast or chest feeding, and just what's normal, what's not normal. All the places that families would normally go to, most of the places families would go to are closed right now. They're not going to public health clinics. Many people aren't even going back to their doctors or midwives clinics. People who may not have, they're in-person postpartum doulas or the lactation consultant that they would have hired, or the breastfeeding clinic they would have gone to, going back to the hospital. There's so many things that are not accessible right now. And so I really encourage, people to try to do this support virtually so that we can still have the healthy outcomes that we all want for people, right?
Yeah, and I think this whole situation has pushed pretty much everyone outside their comfort zones too. And there's been a lot of fast and furious learning of how to do things virtually. And yeah, is it ideal? No. In a lot of cases, it's not ideal, but it can still be really good and really beneficial. So, well, I'll share. Like I see a therapist, and so in person is no longer a possibility right now. Yeah. And so I have, though, continued my appointments virtually. And is it the same as in person? No, it's not. Mm-hmm. But is it extremely helpful and supportive for me? Absolutely, it is. Yeah. So I think, for families, it's important to understand that a large amount of what doulas can do for you, they can provide that virtually. Mm-hmm. That just because it's virtually doesn't mean you're not going to get really good value and really good support.
Yeah, specifically for, really simple questions, situations, and educational content, right? I mean, I can't hold a baby virtually if someone just needs their baby to be held for hours a day because of their own, like I said, physical limitations, disabilities, whatever else might be going on in their situation. But absolutely for education, support, and mental health support, all of that, absolutely.
Great.
So do we want to talk a little bit about the list of essential services and where maybe we fit in?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, when I looked at that, okay, you've got a screen share? Great. Oh,
Yeah.
excellent. Perfect, yeah. So when I looked at that, if you scroll down to number 39, I think it is.
Yeah, I'm going to go there in a sec. I want to start at 12 here.
Okay,
One of the
sure.
things that I've seen people asking about is whether or not we could fit under home childcare services.
Mm-hmm.
So I dug into the Child Care and Early Years Act to see if that's somewhere that we fit. And one of the exemptions of people who don't need a license to fit under this act are people who are providing in-home care to children of that family only. So that means that as a doula, if you've been hired as a postpartum doula to provide home childcare, example maybe for overnight support in the case of a situation where someone had a health condition where they needed support overnight, and you could be considered a childcare worker. So we're taking care of the baby, obviously, for the entire evening, and we wouldn't need to have a license because we're only taking care of that person's baby in their own home. So that's one area that we fit, depending on the situation, of course. And then the other one, so coming back to healthcare and social services, there's a few spots here where we potentially fit in. So I actually, like many doulas, called the hotline that deals with this particular list. I asked some questions about where we fit in. I was told by not just one person, but a follow-up call from someone from the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care that they will not tell businesses if they do or don't fall in one of these numbers. That's not their role. That's up to each individual business to do on a case-by-case basis, because there are some situations where we are going to be considered essential services, and there are going to be other situations where we aren't. So the example that I was given was, landscaping, for example. So they're not going to say that landscaping is an essential service. However, if he said, for example, getting your grass cut right now is not essential. But if you have a tree on your roof, it is essential for you to get someone to come and help you take the tree off of your roof. And so that's where they're not going to say specific roles and professions, if you will, like doula. It's not going to say that, because just like landscaping, across the board, it is not an essential service. But there may be situations under which you fall as an essential service. So for example, looking at number 36, right, providers that deliver home care services or personal support services to seniors or persons with disabilities. What constitutes a disability? So when I specifically listed the example of our client that has disabilities because of medical conditions that aren't pre-existing, but that have been occurring in the last few months, does that construe a disability? And the answer was, I could see that. Right. So it's that reiterating both, from the hotline and then from the other person who called me from the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, reiterating it's case by case. You guys have to decide. You guys doulas have to decide, does this case need you or not?
Yeah, and I made similar calls and heard, pretty well the exact same thing. And yeah, so I would say, definitely, well, maybe not definitely, but possibly for somebody who is recovering from a cesarean birth, that could be considered a disability. It's a short-term disability, but I think that it could be considered that. Yeah. And then, and the other place I think that doulas could fit is under mental health supports.
Yes.
Right. So yes. What do doulas provide? We provide emotional and psychological support to women who are giving birth or people who are giving birth.
Yep. That's something that's in our scope of practice. It's in the research that's been done.
Yeah. So to me, it, that definitely fits. And of course, I mean, like I said, I see a therapist. Are we seeing each other in person right now? No, we're not. All of the mental health workers are doing as much as possible virtually, as they should be. But in some cases, that's not appropriate, and that is reflected in this document here.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, anyone who's working for a doula organization or any organization that is a not-for-profit or a charity providing these services, then of course they fit very nicely into 43 and 44.
Right. Yeah. So not-for-profit organizations that provide critical personal support services in home. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. But I will say, you know, I think that because at the beginning of that document, it said all of this applies equally to for-profit and not-for-profit. And so I'd say it would still be possible to be ticketed if you're a not-for-profit doula. And so you should still take that quite seriously. And then, of course, just, I mean, the main thing is, to me, the main thing is not, you know, are you going to get in trouble? Is the main issue is, are you putting people at undue risk? And that's the question that that you need to always ask yourself as a care provider.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This for the risk, you know, the risk and the benefit both need to be considered very, very seriously. And so let's talk about the legal side of things. Let's talk about that. Some recommendations for doulas that are continuing to work in special cases. I'm recommending that you have a letter from your employer if you have one, your agency if you have one, or from the client if you're an independent doula, that you carry with you your certification documents and paperwork. And then let's share with us your thoughts on the legal side of this, Allison.
Yeah, so, you know, I know I did a whole analysis of this law on a special blog that I've made for COVID-19, and been accused of looking for loopholes, right? But this is what you have to really understand about Canadian law. There's the written law, known as legislation, but law doesn't end at the written law. The written law is subject to common law principles, right? So all written laws that we have are always interpreted according to common law principles. And so those principles are things like fairness, reasonableness, and what was the spirit of the law? What was the intention behind it, right? So, you know,
that's a big part of why they're not being really specific with this job qualifies, this one doesn't, because it's not, this isn't black and white. This whole situation is very fluid, it's very moving and changing, and it's really hard to put black and white laws when it comes to humans, right?
Well, exactly. And even, you know, even laws where the government has had like months and months to look it over and think it over and put it through all the, you know, policy analysts and all of that, when it's put into place and actually being actively used, there's always, every time, there's all kinds of consequences that were not anticipated, always. And, you know, unfortunately for people who aren't specifically listed under the essential services, where that gets decided is usually in court, right? So that's the hard side of things. So I think it's really important right now for doula agencies and associations to think about how are we going to support doulas if they are charged under this public health law.
Yeah, and I just want to preface this by saying no one's going to jail right now, right? And that was a comment that was made to me specifically when I called the hotline on essential services. And the guy said, like, because I said, some of my workers are afraid of getting fined or going to jail. And he said, oh my gosh, first of all, let's stop this talk of going to jail. No one is going to jail. And really, in terms of getting fined, I mean, at this point, we don't have people just randomly pulling, I haven't heard of people randomly getting pulled over and asked what they're doing. Maybe that will come, maybe it won't. I have not heard of that. I don't know if you've heard of that, Allison. For sure, people who are climbing all around, a bunch of teenagers, you know, playing basketball behind a school, yes, some of those people are getting ticketed, but people aren't randomly getting pulled over in their car to see where they're headed. Have you heard of anything like that happening yet?
No, I haven't. And it's important to realize this is a public health law. This is not a criminal statute. So you only go to jail if you're charged with a criminal offense, right? This is not a criminal offense.
Mm-hmm.
Could you get a fine?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, you could get a fine. But there's no debtors' prisons anymore. We don't put people in jail for not being able to pay a fine. Right. And especially if you're part of an association, I think that's something that the doula associations should be looking at, is what kind of support could be provided. But
and that's assuming that we even were to get the fine. I mean, I think depending on the case and the situation, and whether this is someone's, first time being asked about their work versus the 12th time being asked about their work, I think those are all different, factors. I think someone who is very well prepared with a letter from a client or a doctor or their agency explaining this is a really unique case with a client, this is we fall under these numbers for this particular case. I suspect that person wouldn't be fined at all. If they were to be fined, it would get dropped at some point when it was, when the person fought that fine, it would likely get dropped. And even if it didn't, then that's where we get into like what you're talking about with looking to our association. I know our association's working nonstop right now, trying to support, doulas, trying to figure out what's what and confirm different things. And it's tough. It's tough. But, even if you get a fine today, you don't have to pay it tomorrow. Stick that with the parking tickets and save it for when we can get to it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Because because probably if you do get fined, like the person giving you the ticket, they're probably not right now, they're unlikely to exercise much discretion. They're just going to be ticketing everyone that they become aware of, and they're going to let it play out, right? It's not up to them to decide. And so I think it's really important to be totally transparent and open about what you're doing, acting as if you are listed under this law, right? That the services you're providing are included in your mind, because that's an important part of law also. It's something that they're going to take into consideration. So if if you look like you're like trying to hide something, then you're at much greater risk for sure of actually being fined, mm-hmm. right? If you're acting as a professional in a completely transparent way with the knowledge of your client's healthcare provider, as you said, with that letter from your client, mm-hmm. then if it were to come to pass, which I haven't heard of anyone actually being ticketed, no. When the prosecutor looks at that, they might even throw it out at that point. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. If they decide to take it to court, mm-hmm. then you need to be able to show that you were acting in good faith as a professional person.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's incumbent upon us right now as doulas and agencies and leaders in the profession is to really look into and look at which families really need us, where are we actually essential, and where are we not essential. And absolutely, we've said it throughout, and I'm going to say it again, I think we need to be providing virtual support as much as possible.
That's right. Yeah. And if you can show that most of your work is done virtually, and this particular client was a special circumstance, that's also going to strengthen your case.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really easy for us all to feel really afraid with everything that's going on right now. And I just want to make sure that we, both personally and professionally, I think it's really important to refocus on away from fear, focus on why we do this work, how to be well ourselves. And that's not by stewing in fear of what might happen, in fear of getting a ticket, in fear of, exposing someone. Like, there's a point at which we have to look at what we're really here for, what we do as humans, as workers, and really just focus on that, the positive side of that, versus allowing the fear to overwhelm us. It's in the balance, right? And I mean, this is a great rebalancing of our planet right now. And everything is duality, everything is polarity. And how can we bring that into this moment, right? Spending all day on Facebook, on social media, looking at all the bad things, that's going to make you feel like crap. Where's the balance in that? Where are you doing meditation, mindfulness, spending quality time, in your backyard or with your family to balance all of that fear? And so I think it's important to do that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's so important. And yeah, I mean, what I'd like to say too is that I don't, I really don't believe that any doulas should be providing in-person care. It's really a very individual choice too, because it is a much riskier thing to be doing right now. And for some people, it would be completely inappropriate, actually, to be providing in-person care. And so, each individual doula, I think, needs to make their own good informed decision, knowing that, there are some risks that have never been around before.
Absolutely.
And the self-care is so important. I know when I first was doing research to write some articles on COVID-19, I spent a day like researching everything. I couldn't sleep that night.
Mm-hmm.
I know Rebecca of Evidence-Based Birth too, when she did her webinar on COVID-19, the same thing happened to her. She spent the day or a couple of days probably researching it all, couldn't sleep, right? It's
I've had my fair share of sleepless nights for sure since this started, for so many reasons, but
yeah.
It's a lot for everyone to be dealing with, and I really empathize for frontline staff, for workers in businesses losing their businesses, individuals, humans, kids, like, oh my gosh.
No, I know there's so many really difficult things happening right now. And the other thing is, I find everyone's having such a different experience, right? So for some people, it's meant their workload has gone through the roof. Mm-hmm. For other people, it's meant like an extreme amount of isolation and boredom, which is also very stressful.
And actually, mentally harmful for some populations.
Mm-hmm. And then, people like me with families, right? There's 4 of us in the house. We have 2 computers, and 2 of my 2 children are school age. Mm-hmm. And it's a lot to try to coordinate everything and not have it devolve into daily screaming matches,
Mm-hmm. I know.
So it takes a conscious effort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everyone's experience, like you said, is so different for sure. I think one of the things we wanted to talk about in closing was the light at the end of the tunnel.
Oh, right. Yes.
What's at the other side of the rainbow after the storm.
Yeah.
And of course, as part of trying to see that light in the tunnel, I had an opportunity to submit a proposal to the Ontario government around providing virtual support to people in the early postpartum period. So as you can imagine, those people, like we talked about, don't have access to a lot of the supports they usually do. They used to. And some people are getting discharged or wanting to be discharged from the hospital earlier than usual, and then having a lot of questions and knowing where to turn. So we submitted a proposal to provide for doulas to be providing postpartum virtual support. We've been moved on to the next stage of the process, so a bigger proposal has been submitted and we're waiting to hear back. So hopefully that's something that will become available, and the government will help to support that, funding that program, so that we can be helping families who are stuck in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's so amazing to have that, to be building that. So many doulas have really almost completely lost their income right now. And so finding those places where they can get some employment again and be, using those beautiful skills that they have to support people who need support. We
have a group of, thousands of people in Ontario who are very skilled at providing, education, mental health supports to families in that early postpartum period. And I mean, it would be a travesty for them to just be sitting home alone while all the public health nurses who would typically work on Healthy Babies, Healthy Children programs like that across Ontario and have been moved over to COVID-19 situation. And there's just a huge gap right now for families.
So. No, I was so thrilled to hear that you had done that. I think that's amazing. And I really hope that that goes through and that the government supports that with some funding. Fingers crossed. I know. I think this is going to change so many things about how the government does things. It's a bit interesting time, to say the least. But so there are those opportunities that may be opening up too. And so definitely I encourage all doulas to, consider, keep their eye out for those opportunities where, they can use those beautiful skills and service to the people who really need them.
Focus on what we can, not what we can't, which is something we always say in the doula world.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, thanks for sharing your time today. I was glad to be here and participate.
Yeah, thank you. I think I really enjoyed this. This is the first time I did an interview like this. So I'm really thrilled that you agreed to come and speak with me. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.